like to think that I've put a lot of thought into theory crafting and DC Dual Force, but something I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about is theory crafting budget options in DC Dual Force. The reason I haven't put much thought into it is because I'm going to have a full collection in the game anyway. I'm going to purchase all of the cards, or I'm going to do whatever is necessary to get all of the cards. With that said, I know a lot of people would really like to see budget options, and more likely than not, I'll probably set up a free-to-play account for a YouTube series or something like that. So it's probably a reasonable time to start putting in some amount of thought as to what free-to-play decks look like in DC Dual Force. So, what are the rules to define budget in this video? Well, the rules are quite simple. We may only include common and rare cards in our deck. No super rares and no ultimates. There are two exceptions to this rule: Truth and Justice and Batwing. These two cards are unlocked by default despite being super rare cards because they're included as a part of the 3 starter decks in the game. For those curious, here are those 3 starter decks. These are the cards you'll start with when the game launches. Another rule that I applied to myself for this video is that I wouldn't use too many of the same leaders. I also wouldn't let myself use 2 leaders that aren't unlocked by default, at least not in the same deck. So for example, I couldn't play Zatanna and Aquaman together because you don't unlock either of those leaders by default, but I could use Zatanna and Batman, for example, because Batman's unlocked by default, but Zatanna isn't. I also made sure that across all 4 decks, all 5 factions were represented somewhere. So those are our restrictions for these budget deck builds. Let's go over all 4 of them and talk about them broadly. And one last disclaimer, this is just a starting point for budget builds. Your exact optimal list of 40 cards is going to be highly dependent on the cards that you pull from packs and the cards that you craft. There's not going to be crafting during this upcoming beta weekend, but crafting will be added later down the line. With that out of the way, let's jump straight into the Aquaman Batman list. You probably heard about Aquaman Batman as a combination of leaders throughout the beta because a lot of people really like this combination of leaders. They're both fantastic leaders on their own. Batman's really good at controlling the board on his own, and then Aquaman's really good at building up your own board rather than controlling the opponent's board. On the tactics side of the deck, we've basically built the best gadget package that we can with the restrictions that we've talked about. Thankfully, Batwing's unlocked by default as one of the better gadget cards. I'll just point out some key cards for new players. Commissioner Gordon, Batwing, Alfred, and Batarang are all really key, important cards for this deck. If you're an experienced player, the biggest question mark you'll see in this list is Star Labs research. I did some looking into the randomness of Star Labs research and the different outcomes it can get, and I think in a budget deck like this one, Star Labs research is just a better card than, say, something like Master Strategist, which they're both quote-unquote draw 3 cards, but the generation effect from Star Labs research is probably better than the draw card in this particular budget deck. On the red side of the deck, we're mostly relatively tempo-oriented. We're running cards like Superman Robot to slow down aggressive strategies, Wildcat to focus on tempo, Antiope's just a good card to run in general. Blue Devil's honestly not our strongest option, but it has like high roll scenarios that we're super happy about. Think of it as kind of like running Clark Kent. It's not exactly 1-to-1, but it's kind of similar. Hammer Throw is actually a really good card with Aquaman because Aquaman puts a body on your board, so you're always going to have a body for Hammer Throw's effect. So oftentimes on turn 3, you can generate a sea creature, use Hammer Throw to kill off one of their weaker units, and then use Aquaman's attack to kill off another weaker unit. So it's kind of like an anti-aggro removal tool. We're running 2 copies of Dual Force because it's a common card, so you should be able to get access to this card really quickly. Plus, it works really well with Aquaman. We can use Aquaman's ability, and then on our next turn, we can use Dual Force and then use Aquaman's ability again, start building up a really strong board. And then we're running Swamp Thing as our big top-end card. I really like Swamp Thing, especially in a budget environment, because a lot of people aren't going to have good options against Swamp Thing. They're going to have a really hard time of dealing with the guard effect. But if for whatever reason you don't like Swamp Thing, feel free to throw in any gold recruit here. It should be fine. I do think Swamp Thing's the best option, though. So in conclusion, this is a very tempo-oriented deck that's capable of some really large board states, whether it be because of a huge Batwing or because of some giant sea creatures. And you should have no trouble clearing up the board in the early stages of the game and moving into that later stage of the game where you're really going to thrive. This next deck has a much more concentrated game plan. It's a Harley Quinn Joker list. This deck's got a pretty big focus on adrenaline, so much so that we're even running Murderous Mugger, who's probably not the best card in the world, but he helps us empty our hand really quickly. We're also running 2 copies of Embrace Madness to get a discard proc during our bronze turns. We're running the strong Arkham inmate cards like Clayface and Ventriloquist, and a handful of firepower synergy cards to not only combo with our Joker, but also that previously mentioned Ventriloquist. We're also running 2 copies of Shoot Randomly itself, so on turn 3 we could do like Dead Shot, Shoot Randomly to clear the board. There's even going to be scenarios where we go like Jailbreak, and then that pulls a punchline, and then we do Shoot Randomly. We're also running 2 copies of Onomatopoeia. That's a bit of a more difficult card to acquire. You have to get that, I believe, from the Green Arrow set as well. I really like this package. I was running a list pretty similar to this. I've made some concessions because of the budget restriction that we're working with, but I ran a list pretty close to this during the first beta, and I really liked it. So I assume that I'm going to enjoy playing this type of deck again in the future. And it just happens to be the case that a lot of these cards are very budget friendly. friendly. It's a very aggressive deck, and you'll notice that as soon as you play one game of this, you'll be emptying your hand so fast, drawing new cards because of Harley Quinn, clearing up the board with Joker's effect. One quick piloting tip I want to mention before we move on: if you can avoid using the Joker's effect until turn 4, the upside's a lot better because you get to go Joker's effect on turn 4, and then assuming you have an Arkham inmate in play, you can use Joker's effect again the following turn on turn 5, which can make for a much larger tempo swing than doing it on 3 and then again on turn 5. Just something to keep in mind. Up next is our Zatanna Wonder Woman list. I so desperately wanted to include a spell list. I absolutely love the magical spell archetype, and this is the best budget option I could come up with. Unfortunately, one of the spell archetype's most powerful cards is locked behind a super rare card, and if you pull that super rare card, I would highly recommend removing Captain Atom or perhaps Dr. Fate from this list to include Giovanni Zatara. But because we don't have access to Giovanni Zatara, this is the best I could come up with for spells. We have a little bit of cross synergy with Mary Bromfield and some of the aura cards in the Might faction. That's pretty cool. We're also running Hawk Girl and some buff cards. The buff cards are just strictly good cards anyway. Amazonian Braces and Super Strength are great. If you can Amazonian Braces something like John Constantine to protect him, maybe he lives an extra turn and you can get off some spell effects with John Constantine. But also those buff cards synergize well with our Hawk Girl that's on the red side of the faction. The nice thing about running that kind of buff package with Hawk Girl is that Hawk Girl will also synergize with a decent number of the spells generated by Zatanna. Any of the free cards that happen to affect Hawk Girl are nice. This is slightly more niche, but we could do situations where we go Smoke and Mirrors and Hawk Girl together just to draw the card. Yeah, lots of spell interaction possible with Hawk Girl. It won't always be the best line, but knowing that those lines are available can open up some interesting paths for you throughout the game. The main appeal of running Zatanna and Wonder Woman together is that Zatanna is quite slow. We're taking quite a few of the early turns just to stack our hand with stronger and stronger spells, and if that's the case, we're going to fall behind on the board. Wonder Woman helps us kind of catch up a little bit and maintain that board control with her very powerful 4 attack ability. Don't get me wrong, not every game is going to be this game where you're sitting back and slowly acquiring more spells. There's going to be more tempo oriented games when we draw kind of the red side of our deck, because most of our bronze cards are really high tempo cards. Steve Trevor is a huge tempo card in this deck. Antiope's just a good body. Wildcat is of course a big tempo card as well, and then Queen Hippolyta as a way to kind of round out that curve can lead to some pretty strong board states. So it's going to depend on your hand how you really play out a deck like this. Sometimes the spells are going to be your core win condition, and other times they're just going to support your existing board state. And that's why I really like Captain Atom in this list, because if we end up going that tempo oriented route and then come turn 5 we have say like 2 cards on board, giving them aura can be a huge difference maker. And the last deck I want to go over today is probably one of the decks I was most surprised by. This is a Lex Luthor Superman control list. If you've seen any of my other videos, you might have heard me refer to Superman as kind of the Might version of Lex Luthor, in that a lot of times their abilities are essentially the same. They're just KO over recruit. It's not quite that simple because Superman doesn't have the Hunter keyword, so if something is blocking Superman's target, he won't be able to deal with it in the same way that Lex can. But oftentimes, the two effects are very similar in that they're removing a card. And I just randomly thought to myself, what if we just run both and we use them as really strong removal tools, and then we just jam-pack the rest of the deck with this kind of mid-range shield package that the game encourages you to run, with Lois Lane and Bibbo to help support our shield cards. And honestly, the list ended up being pretty good. In the few playtests that I did on Tabletop Simulator with this package, it was genuinely surprising. Going into turn 3, which is a key turn for us because we have Superman's effect on turn 3, or maybe it'll be turn 4 depending on whether you go first or second. But oftentimes you'll be put in a situation where you'll have like a pretty underwhelming turn, or what would otherwise be a pretty underwhelming turn, which is something like, I don't know, play Superboy and I don't know, a random bronze card like Talon. In a vacuum, that's not a super strong turn, but if you're removing, say, something like a Gorilla Grodd from their side of the board when you use Superman's effect, or if you're just removing any one of their silver cards with your Superman effect, and then you're developing a Superboy and, say, something like a Lois Lane or a Talon or whatever, that turn is infinitely better. And then the next turn, you get another KO effect from Lex Luthor's ability. And then after Lex Luthor's turn, now you're into your gold turns, and you have access to another hard removal tool in Omega Beams. The nice thing about this is we also get to run Friends in High Places, which is a fantastic card. We don't have access to a ton of incredible golden cards that we would love to synergize with Friends in High Places. So honestly, our best options are Supergirl, who's a fantastic target for Friends in High Places depending on our current board state. Let's say on turn 4, we played a big shield card like Superboy, or even Superman Robot or Crypto or something. On turn 5, if we don't have Supergirl in hand, we can play Friends in High Places to go find Supergirl, play Supergirl, buff up one of our big shield cards, and then all of a sudden our board state just got a heck of a lot stronger. There's situations where we run out of gas and instead we pick up Brainiac to try and get some more draw card. There's some niche synergy that Truth and Justice has in the deck. Most notably, it hits Brainiac Drone. So you can take a Brainiac Drone that the opponent's ignoring and give it +2/+2, and now all of a sudden it's an attacker on board that otherwise wouldn't have existed. Kind of like playing a card with speed. Obviously, Brainiac Drone also has synergy with Lex Luthor, which which is the main reason we're running the card. That little combo also lets us run Ritual Sacrifice, which can be good for removing large cards from the opponent's side of the board. We just have access to so many removal tools. Superman, Lex Luthor, Ritual Sacrifice, Omega Beams. The opponent can't get away with playing big cards against us because we're going to instantly deal with them and then develop a stronger board. I imagine there's going to be hands where this deck really bricks, but despite that, I think this deck's going to feel very powerful in certain matchups. So there you go. Those are my 4 budget decks. We have a Lex Luthor Superman control list, a kind of mid-rangey spell list, an aggressive Arkham inmates list, and a tempo sea creature gadget list. Let me know what you think, and let me know if you want to see any other deck building videos or theory crafting videos for DC Dual Force. I'm absolutely in love with this game, and I couldn't be looking forward to the next beta any more than I already am. Keep being awesome, and I'll catch you in the next one.